Western political scientists claim that war, imperial expansion, and endless conflict are immutable laws of human nature. But what if our entire understanding of geopolitics is flawed? Yes, because it's based on just 1,500 years of European bloodshed. Well, is China destined to become an aggressive global empire, or does its 2,000 years old Confucian DNA operate on a complete different logic of statecraft? Well, here I will bring Professor Jeffrey Sachs explaining to us in this very short part I brought to you why Western strategists are fundamentally misreading Beijing's next move. Jeffrey.
Emmanuel's counts 300 year this kind of formed our way of looking at the world, because our political theories tend to assume that you have this unavoidable geopolitical rivalry that is almost a law of nature. How do you think China would be different? Its geopolitical mentality would be different than, for example, the way the Europeans have behaved, because we always assumed it's all universal.
This is also an absolutely fascinating and much debated question, I would say, but I have my own views, which I'll share. And that is that the decisive event in Western political culture, if I may put it that way, is 476 AD, which is the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when Rome is conquered by Germanic conquerors. And at that point, it was a long process, but with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe fragmented into multiple political entities. In fact, a complete, complex, remarkable kaleidoscope of political entities, of city-states and kingdoms and dukedoms and every conceivable form of political organization, from the tiniest level up through would-be European-wide empires that never quite reached their billing, like the Holy Roman Empire that Charlemagne, in effect, began. But as was famously said, it was never quite holy, never Roman, and never an empire in the way that it built itself. But the point is, Europe was and is and remained, despite Napoleonic aspirations, despite Charlemagne's aspirations, despite what Hitler tried, never became a unified political entity. And today's European Union is a different kind and still very weak construction of some kind of European-wide political organization. Europe fragmented and basically engaged in within European war for 1,500 years. And war became the standard. And thinking about statecraft is thinking about conflict in Europe. And so the idea that statecraft is anarchic, the famous assumption of realism in international relations theory, is a good first projection of European reality, roughly from around 500 AD to at least, let's say, to 1950. And the idea that states therefore collide with each other, compete with each other, fight with each other, conquer each other, defeat each other, succumb, and so forth, is European statecraft thinking. China is very, very different in its history. China unified in 221 BCE in the Qin dynasty, the first unification. And China's geographically kind of a box. The box has dryland steppe region, so-called, to the north, the Himalayas to the west, the tropical forests of Southeast Asia to the south, and the East China Sea, the Pacific Ocean to the east. It's a box that became a state, a unified administrative state, more than 2,000 years ago. China fragmented at times. The Qin dynasty gave way to the Han era. The Han era broke apart, then became later reunited in the Tang and the Song and the Yuan and the Ming and the Qing dynasties. But one could say that for most of the last 2,200 years, China has been a centralized administrative state. And the philosophy underpinning China is a Confucian philosophy that emphasizes the importance of harmony in keeping this integrated state functioning. Now, it's debated, does this lead to a different kind of statecraft of China? My answer is yes, it does actually. China does not think in terms of Western anarchic international statecraft. China thinks in terms of a large Chinese state, where internal order is decisive, and where external imperialism was never the rule for 2,000 years. China's vast and did not look for overseas territories, by and large. Yes, one can point to particular places and episodes, but by and large, China had peaceful relations with its neighbors. I'll just give one example. From 1368, which is the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, to 1839, which is Britain's invasion of China in the First Opium War. So roughly for, 500 years, China did not engage in almost any fighting with its East Asian neighbors, with Japan, with Korea, and with Vietnam. With Vietnam, there was about a 17-year period of war in the 15th century. With Korea, as far as I know, China never invaded Korea even once, but China was the dominant power. And in Western statecraft, you'd say, well, China would invade and take over. Never tried. China never, during this period, invaded Japan, not even once. It was invaded by Japan once in 1592, I believe it is, or at least an attempt by a Japanese shogun, a military commander, to invade China. It failed, of course. But in any event, you had essentially a half a millennium of peace in East Asia. It's sometimes called the Confucian peace. Now, when I discuss this with our friend John Mearsheimer, a dear friend and a great political scientist, as far as I'm concerned, he says, no, China will behave just the same way as any other great power. And he doesn't agree with this idea that China has a different kind of statecraft. I beg to differ. I love and admire John, but I disagree with him. I think China's view of statecraft is different, and it has been shaped by a different 2,000 years of history.
Professor Sachs.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Professor Jeffrey has a very different vision of China than Professor John Mearsheimer does. And that's very important. One of the reasons is that he's not a realism. So what Professor Jeffrey outlines here is actually a profound challenge to the foundation axioms of the Western international relation theory. Because to understand why Jeffrey disagrees with John, we must actually look at the epistemological roots of the Western statecraft itself. Since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in European history was characterized by multipolar anarchy. So a continuous struggle among fragmented powers has pretty much been a reality since always in the past. So theories like Thomas Hobbes, right? Thomas Hobbes, surely John loves Thomas Hobbes because he's pretty much the first creator of any realist theory of the world. Not to speak about Machiavelli and Professor Kenneth Waltz. But beyond that, treaty anarchy and perpetual power maximization as universal laws of nature, as Mearsheimer does in the offensive realism, posits that any rising state will naturally seek regional hegemony and project power outward to maximize security. I would be even more specific, because in John's theory, there is two things a nation state wants to be. First is to become a regional hegemony, so that none of your neighbors cannot even think about invading you, attacking you, or grabbing any piece of land from you. The second objective is, after you became a regional hegemony, the second objective is to stop and preventing any other state from also becoming a regional hegemony. Because according to John's theory, once you have become a regional hegemony, your next step is to become a global one. So that's what he believes, that China cannot rise peacefully, and that Professor Jeffrey disagrees completely. Because he highlights the critical historical counter-narrative that China's statecraft was shaped not by perpetual external anarchy, but by internal administrative consolidation inside a geographically self-contained zone. So following the Qing unification in 2021 before Christ, that's right, because China is more than 3,000 years old, the Chinese strategic imperative become internal stability, 天下, anchored by the Confucianism relational harmony, rather than naval empire building, invading Americas. The historian Martin Jacques, which I like very much, noted that in his book When China Rules the World, that China operates as a civilizational state where order takes precedence over expansion. During the Ming Dynasty, for example, despite possessing the world's most advanced naval fleet under Zheng He, even so, China chose not to colonize distant lands, constructing sharply with the European age of discovery and exploration and colonialism and bloodshed. So the fundamental danger here of the modern foreign policy is mirror imaging. That's pretty much one of the things that Professor Jeffrey Sachs brought us in this short video. Because assuming Beijing will actually act like the 19th century Britain or the 20th century America, if the Western strategists continue to protect European historical patterns of the 2,000 years old Confucian statecraft, they risk creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of war. So real global stability, guys, in the 21st century will not come from forcing China into a Western box, but from recognizing, among other things, that different civilizational trajectories produce fundamental different geopolitical behaviors. And this is crucial to understand, and it's crucial to count on any calculation. If you believe that's important, if you agree or disagree with that, please comment here. Let a comment below about what you think about all these mess that the Western powers are trying to do so that they don't collapse at once. And if you believe it's important, if you like short pieces, very well curated, selected for you, subscribe, support us, because this century is only getting started.